I'd like to introduce to you Yair. He is the CTO and co-founder at Autorio.
Yeah.
Autorio. And Yair is the CTO and co-founder with a background leading cybersecurity divisions in the Israeli Defense Force focused on national critical systems. And then we have Sandra. Sandra has over 15 years of experience in IT and OT cybersecurity. She's been guiding enterprises in their cybersecurity journey and specializing in regulatory compliance and infrastructure protection. So give them both a big Texas welcome. Thank them for being here on this late afternoon, and we'll hear from Yair and Sandra.
Thank you. Thank you for staying with us on this late afternoon on the second day. Well, hopefully this will be valuable and interesting for you guys. So first of all, pleasure being here, and thank you for the great introduction. Maybe a bit about myself and where does the insights you're going to see within this presentation are coming from. So, of course, after my service time, founding Autorio, we are focused on OT cybersecurity, and we've been working for the last few years with a lot of large industrial companies, manufacturing, smart infrastructure, distribution centers, energy, critical infrastructure, and I still have the pleasure of working with different, I would say, type of stakeholders within those organizations, and the goal of today's session is really to share with you some of our insights, some of our things we see, and hopefully this will be insightful for you.
Thanks so much, Yair. And as you heard before, Sandra Topalovic, I am the Technical Customer Success Manager at Autorio, and I manage our customers' life cycle and their journey with us from an onboarding and deployment, and then the entire journey perspective. So my job is to make sure that the customer's deployment doesn't just look good on paper, but that it also actually works in the real world after it's deployed. But it all does start with the deployment. So today we'll be covering some of the strategies that we utilize to make our customer journey successful, and I hope that by the end of this you'll walk away with some strategies and some tips that'll help you in your journey.
Okay, so let's talk about first giving you some context. By the way, what we even usually say, especially for the OT market, this is a journey. And we even usually say like we're more of a solution company than just a technology vendor, because this is a journey. And it also reflects and influences people, processes. It's not just technology. And again, we are working with usually, I would say, our typical type of customers are large enterprises. We're usually talking about between dozens of sites to sometimes hundreds of sites from different types of industries. So it's not just IT and OT type of challenges, but it's also international language barriers, different types of processes. As we all know, this industry is also being driven by M&As. So within the same company, different types of sites with different types of architectures. So just to give you some context of, again, who are we talking about when we're seeing those things? The second part is stakeholders. So stakeholders is also very critical in this specific domain, because I'm guessing even if you're going to walk around today, the conference, you're going to see a lot of people from IT and OT, security teams and automation teams, operational teams. And it's even more common when we're going to OT security focused conferences, you're going to see a lot of this. And it's also interesting to see the different mindset, the different agendas, the different cultures, blue collars, white collars, which we'll address today because there's a lot of things, again, relationship-wise, that create some kind of tension and challenges when addressing this specific market. I will say that we're seeing as a trend that the CISO is usually starting to drive this project and the budget and things related to. But at the end of the day, the people on site has a lot of influence because they will be the ones actually taking actions or doing something with it. So stakeholders and the differences is a key element in this market. And again, size, we usually are talking about large size companies, I don't know, from a few billions to hundreds of billions of revenues, with a few sites to hundreds of sites. And I also say usually that, again, as I mentioned, within those organizations, there's a difference between even like the sites themselves. Like large sites will usually have more stakeholders, people responsible, and things like that compared to smaller sites with sometimes unmanned sites. So this needs to be taken into consideration when projects are starting to move along. So let's talk about briefly, again, adding some context, what do we see out there? This, I think, will not be a lot of surprises, but hopefully the next ones you'll see as we address them will be more insightful. So drivers to this market, right? Regulation. I think as a global company, definitely Europe is leading on that. NIS2, which will be enforced officially starting this October, although some countries it will take longer within the EU. But to those who are not familiar, NIS2 is an expansion for NIS1, which was basically up until before only critical infrastructure, where now it basically addresses almost any manufacturing company. CRA, Cyber Resilience Act in Europe. Of course, here in North America, it's more critical infrastructure, but just to give you some context on that. Legacy systems, here, again, here it's not a surprise. We're talking about environments that people are scared of touching from dozens of years ago. We're also going to talk about what ways do we have to address those types of environments. Sometimes network equipment, very old network equipment. So how do you address those specific use cases when there's a lot of concern around that? Skilled workforce shortages. I think in general, right, cybersecurity, we all know there's a lack of talent pool. And even more than that, think about it, when someone enters the cybersecurity domain, there's more likelihood that he'll go work for a tech company or things like that than working within, I don't know, some pulp mill or some refinery or things like that. So this is something that we're seeing and is making a little bit more harder for a lot of companies to address that. Of course, the larger ones has more resources. The ones that are mid-size have less, and this is something that we'll address as well. IT-OT collaboration. This is key for either a failure or a success of a project. As I mentioned, right, we have different people all of a sudden working on the same goal, although sometimes they don't really see it that way, right? Because all of a sudden, up until now, IT security was somewhere up there, and now they're getting into our territory. This is what what we're seeing in the market. People are staying within the sites themselves. So this is a big challenge, and it's not related to technology. It's all about people, processes, culture, relationship, which we'll talk about as well. Scalability issues. This is another key element that we're seeing a lot companies out there are struggling. There are different vendors, different solutions, different approaches, but the thing is that we're talking about, again, large enterprise companies, and think about it, deploying a solution with hundreds of sites, with potential thousands of network devices or sensors and things like that, the whole total cost of ownership becomes very, very challenging. How do you deploy? How do you roll out? How do you maintain for a long period of time? And this is a key element, again, which I think is more unique to the OT space. One last thing, vendor management. So again, think about it, the whole supply chain of OT is complex, I think. So how do you manage that? How do you know exactly what's happening out there? Again, you don't have always the right team for being everywhere, and doing that is complex. How do you make sure that you don't have siloed solutions? And how do you create a more cohesive way of getting to understanding of what you have in there?
So you bought a solution for your environment, and you're getting ready to deploy it. What works and what doesn't work? We know at Otorio, we know that there are certain things that absolutely work really well and set a project up for success, and we also know things that don't work. And we do the absolute best that we can to guide our customers in the right direction. At the end of the day, it is up to the customer, and there are many factors that we're going to be discussing throughout the presentation that really drive this, but our principle is always educate the customer and guide them in the right direction to set them up for success long term. So we know that a phased implementation approach takes a large project and it chunks it out into smaller phases. And as you move from phase to phase, each one of those phases can be evaluated, it can be improved, and it can be iterated for the next phase to improve and add lessons learned and not carry over the hurdles that maybe we encountered in the previous phase. Define clear milestones. If you know the milestones that you're working toward, it allows the deployment teams to be disciplined in focusing on outcomes rather than just activities. If we're just focusing on activities, it's really difficult to measure progress, or sometimes it's easy to get lost in where we are and the progress that has been made in the deployment project. Again, Yair touched on this, but collaboration and enablement between IT and OT teams. Historically, we know that those two teams have worked in silos completely separately from one another, and they even have different reporting structures. So IT reports to the enterprise or corporate management, whereas OT might report to operations management. And sometimes they're going to have disconnected or even competing priorities or agendas. So it's important to bring everybody to the table and allow them to be a part of the planning phase so that you can cover multiple angles and have a broader perspective on the deployment. Because if you only launch a project from the IT side without taking into consideration what the OT resources might bring, you might miss some critical points where, you know, they're going to bring another perspective to the table, and they might have more efficient strategies that they've seen from their perspective that would help in the deployment process. Global governance with regional adjustments. So it is important to have a single point of guidance that sees the big picture and works toward the corporate strategy. What problems are we looking to solve on a grand scale? With that, it's also important to take into account some regional tweaks. For example, you know, if you're doing a remote deployment and your deployment team is from the United States, but you're deploying in APAC, one of the things that you may want to consider is, of course, you know, there's the time difference, but one of the things that we've seen is in the deployment process, the US-based team was going to do the deployment. we were dealing with hardware, so the equipment was already racked and stacked and ready to go. It was networked and everything. And then the configuration was going to be done on US time. Well, good thing that we engaged the local sites in the planning process, because we learned that this happened to be in Japan, and we learned that the site actually turns off the entire plant, power to the entire plant, including network equipment. Everything gets powered off, which would have meant that when it's daytime for us and when we were planning to deploy, the site would have been inaccessible. So it's little tweaks like that that are very important to understand. And then, of course, work weeks. Different regions of the world have different work weeks. You have to take into account the site's local working hours. I mean, the list goes on and on. So very important in bringing in the different resources to participate and give input. Things that don't work. One size fits all. Of course, if you have one cookie cutter format for how you're going to deploy without taking into account the nuances of the different regions, different sites, different equipment that might be present at the location, you're going to run into hurdles. Again, I cannot emphasize enough, if there's one thing that I want you guys to walk away with today, it's the emphasis on the absolute critical importance of IT-OT collaboration. And the fact that you're in this room, I think you guys might have an idea of how important that is. A top-down rollout approach without local buy-in. Again, it's really challenging to get cooperation from local sites or sites in different regions if they're just suddenly one day surprised that, oh, here comes a project we're deploying in your environment, and they've had no heads up about what it is that the solution is going to do for them, how it's going to integrate into their existing infrastructure, what it's going to do. So a situation like that tends to create resistance. And it's a lot better to engage them from the beginning so that they're prepared and they're walking the planning stages of the project with you so that they understand how all of this is going to come together and what it means for them.
Maybe one small thing to add from experience perspective, we're learning the hard way. I mean, as a vendor, sometimes we want to have shorter cycles. Right? We want to move fast, we want to build a business and everything all together. What we've learned, probably the hard way, is that in these specific things, like there's no shortcuts. Because whenever, I mean, we had a use case where a CISO really wanted to push everything and roll it out fast and everything all together without involving in the right time the people on site, the plan teams, and so I mean, everything started moving very fast, but then it was stuck for a very long time. And since then, like, we're really insisting, even working with the CISOs and the security teams, make sure that you're involving in advance the people on site. So they can be, they can have their buy-in, they can have their influence, they can be onboarded and engaged. That maybe by the way, it may be for us sometimes prolong the sales cycle, which is something that's, as a founder, I don't want to happen, but at the end of the day, I want to have successful projects. So this is something we've learned for the hard way, that there are no shortcuts here, and we want to make sure that we have the right stakeholders involved from the very early beginning.
Looks like the slide got a little skewed, but that's okay. So some actionable insights on do's and don'ts for large deployments. Setting measurable key objectives. Again, I mentioned this earlier. You need to have measurable key objectives that the teams can work towards. And this is also going to help in holding the different resources accountable for their pieces. It is difficult to measure progress if you don't have key milestones defined. I would say, you know, I've been on projects where there have been disconnects between different internal teams at the customer site because one side had the understanding that well, the objective of the project is to deploy the solution, but that's such a broad concept, right? What does that mean? To one team, it meant actually racking, stacking, and installing the solution, while the other team had the expectation that everything would be fully deployed and configured. And the configuration piece is very, very important because, as we know, sometimes that can take the most amount of time, and it's going to vary. Configuration, installation and deployment, for the most parts, a lot of that can be not automated, but it can be a cookie cutter format because it's going to be the same. It's the configuration piece that differs. And so really understanding what's going on at the local sites and also allowing those folks to give input and also bring their stakeholders to the table is very important. You might have network engineering at one location where that might be absorbed by a different team, maybe the OT team. They call it the OT team, but they're responsible for all things technology at the location. So taking nuances into account, very important. Again, building cross-functional teams for a holistic strategy. The more people you have that are participating in the plan, I want to be careful when I say that. So of course you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen. There should be one strategic direction that's led from a centralized location, but at the same time you do want to have, if you're going to have network traffic that needs to be monitored, or network configuration that plays a role, or you have application people that need to be a part of it. You want to bring everybody together and allow them to give the different perspectives on how the deployment is going to work. Leveraging automation for real-time insights. So this is a two-piece what am I trying to say? A two-piece combo. So on the one side, you want, as you go through the configuration of your solution, you want to leverage automation wherever possible. What does that mean? So for example, you can have a point-in-time configuration that allows the customer to see the, let's say in our case, the assessment of your cybersecurity posture as a one-time snapshot. Getting the buy-in from the different teams that are involved to continuously configure automation is also a key piece of that, and it gives you insights into what is actually happening in the environment. The other part, from a project perspective, is leverage tools that are going to help you to see where the project is at and how you're going to drive it forward. So tools that allow you to collaborate with other teams and everybody can stay on the same page and see what is currently happening, tasks that have been done, what's ahead, timelines, that kind of thing.
Maybe one small thing to add, and again, I'm sharing some specific from the field stories regarding the holistic team. So one thing we saw, which is really interesting, a CISO from a large manufacturing company, he was trying to drive a project for the plants, and he nominated someone to lead the project from the IT team, and it was just not successful. He was trying to address the sites, and to be honest, nobody gave about him, right? Like literally nobody cared about what he's saying. He doesn't understand us. He doesn't understand our challenges. He's coming from IT. What does he know? And what was really interesting, at some point, he changed some things, and he actually took one person from the site, a very strong personnel, and nominated him to the IT security team to take the lead project of basically rolling out to the sites. All of a sudden, what was really interestingly happening, the sites themselves, the people from the site could not resist. They could not come and say, "Hi, he doesn't understand us. He doesn't have a clue what our environments mean," because he is one of us. He was just a second ago, just exactly like us, responsible and doing the same thing and have the same background. So for me, like, this was a really interesting use case, how taking, again, someone that, like, from the other side that represents the, again, being one of the folks, really helped them to start moving things around much faster. So again, just as an example, what does it mean having different types of members and different types of stakeholders with different types of mindsets and experience?
Thanks, Harrier. And then some of the don'ts. Don't prioritize technology over process. So you can have the shiniest new tool, you can integrate all the technology in the world, but the processes are what drive the usage of the technology. So if you don't have your processes defined, you're setting yourself up for failure. The other part is technologies are really supposed to integrate into your existing processes or enhance them, not necessarily replace them. Of course, the onboarding of new technologies might introduce new processes, but the goal is to always have a process that defines how the technology is going to be used, what problems it's going to solve, and who's going to be using the platform. And then, of course, don't neglect change management. It is absolutely an essential part. We have walked into scenarios where the teams that we were working with were under the impression that they did not have to follow the change management process, even though one existed within their organization, only to find out that once the deployment began, they had to backtrack, and this adds wait times, and it just skews the timeline of the project. But if you have a change management process, follow it, do your due diligence upfront. It not only helps to streamline the activities within the project, but it also helps to keep track of what was done in previous stages, so that as the project moves along and it progresses, you can reference, old management, change management requests and things like that are going to help you to move forward. So phase deployment, key. We've been talking about it for a while now. Start where the conditions are optimal for the project. So many times for us, the ideal place to start is in the region where the headquarters of the business is. So if the business is located in EMEA, for example, it makes sense for us to start out with some EMEA sites. If it's a US-based business, we want to start out with some US sites. And the reason being is that the stakeholders that are directly involved with the project, and the primary project managers, drivers, sponsors, if they're available in region, the factors that play a role are, a lot of our deployments are remote, but if the site needs to be accessed physically, geography matters. How close is it? What technologies are present there? Time zones, resource availability. All those things are a factor, and they create, they allow us to take a small chunk of the project, deploy it, test it, see where tweaks need to happen, and then iterate, and then leave off the more challenging sites or deployments for a later phase once you already have some project experience with that specific platform under your belt. Localized playbooks. So again, global strategy with local tweaks. You can have a global strategy of what is it that we're trying to accomplish for the business with this platform? What problems are we solving? But then beyond that, there may be some advantages that the local sites can also walk away with in terms of, there's an opportunity for an additional integration at site A, but maybe not at site B. I mentioned, the Japan site killing their power to preserve energy at night, those kinds of things. Really understanding what's happening at the local sites and then marrying that with the global strategy will give you a very powerful way to charge ahead. Another thing I wanted to mention about the regional flexibility is that we had a couple instances where customers recognized, different type of equipment, different use cases and whatnot. And in our case, our solution also provides, it provides different types of capabilities, but one of them is revealing network posture or, exposures and gaps. And we had been deploying that at different sites, and then we got to one site where, we did the configuration and everything, and then the local network teams were not ready to consume the findings of our platform. So even though we actually provided more information to them, they saw it as a step ahead that they were not ready for at the time, just because they did not have enough resources to mitigate it then and there. So really working with the teams and understanding where in the journey they are and then meeting them on their journey is absolutely critical.
Maybe one small thing about that.
Yeah.
It's at the end of the day, it's resistance, right? Because and we all know that usually change create resistance. Not everyone are in favor. There's a lot of things that have been done in a specific way for many years, and all of a sudden there's some change, there's some new things coming into play, and there's usually, what we're saying is there's some type of resistance. I think what we saw is successful is, again, even like sharing key messages that this is not to go and find who's not doing things right, but as of we have the same goal of getting better. So it's just to help us understand where we are at, and based on that, where we want to go. So again, just keep that in mind, because this is something we saw in specific sites, that when people start seeing the findings, they were like, wait a second, I don't want anyone else to see that. Right? Wait a second. Before you plug it in, before you do anything, let me go fix very fast some things so I'll have a better scoring, or I have a better something finding, right? So again, keep that in mind. This is something cultural, very deep, that sometimes we forget about the people that we work with, but it is a key factor for success.
Thanks, Yair. And lastly, the unified technology stack. So whenever possible, you want to standardize and unify the technology stack that you're working with. Of course, there are going to be nuances that are going to add complexity to your configurations, but in a nutshell, whenever possible, take advantage of what you already have. Very important, because if it's easy to neglect the capabilities that you already have in-house, which can lead to, misconfigurations, overspending, just waste of resources. We've emphasized this a few times throughout today's presentation, and I'm going to say it again because it's absolutely crucial. Engage stakeholders early in the process to avoid resistance. The more that you have adoption, the earlier that you involve key stakeholders and you get adoption early on, the more successful the deployment will be. There is, I want to say, there's absolute value in making sure that the deployment is successful, because that's going to set you up on a trajectory for success in the operational phase, and actually operationalizing the tool within your environment. Investing in a strong change management program, we talked about that as well, and the importance of it. Prioritizing basic cybersecurity hygiene before complex solutions. Again, take advantage of what you already have in your environment. Leverage the resources, processes, everything that you have in-house already before you start adding complexity. Same goes for the deployment. So start out small, do the easier things first, and then tackle the more complex pieces. And then create a feedback loop within your organization so that you can capture the lessons learned throughout the deployment and apply them to the subsequent phases as you move along.
So let's talk about some few elements before we wrap it up. And I do think that maybe one point to emphasize before I get to the slide, Sandra talked about it, key mission metrics. And this is something that is very specific to the organization. And why am I saying this is so important? Because at the end of the day, this is what we see help our champions we work with be successful within the organizations they are. Because when they set the key mission metrics that they want to be measured upon, that they want to show their success internally, this is really help for adoption, for engagement, for endorsement, right? Because if you set the goals, you even go to your management, you align with them, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, and you get their blessing. And as things are moving along, you show them the progress. This is a strong key to success that will help you continue moving along. Now, some additional things that maybe to emphasize, right, when choosing different types of technologies and things to work with. First of all, context matters. What does it mean? It means that you don't really have to go and deploy everywhere. Again, go back to the key mission metrics. We have, for example, right now a large pharmaceutical company that we're working with, and they told us, I want to focus first on the few dozen sites that are the most critical for me from a revenue and productivity perspective. So it doesn't mean that there's need to be immediate global rollout. And also within those sites, right? When we're talking about taking mitigations or taking some of the findings and insights from them, it doesn't mean you need to take care of everything. Context matters. Not all assets were born equal, especially in this specific space. We've seen use cases where sometimes there's an asset that serves a specific critical process within the plant that, okay, it represents a major risk from a productivity, from a safety, from reliability, so maybe it should be addressed first. So again, context matters, and this is why I think a lot of IT security controls or solutions sometimes are struggling in this space because they're not really fit for the mindset or the contextualization that is required within the OT space. Sandra talked about it, leverage existing security controls for better return of investment. We're seeing at the end of the day, there has been some investments in the past. It could be just firewalls and just some basic segmentation. It could be even EDR solutions. It could be different types of controls. Sometimes, by the way, within DCS systems, there are just configurations that could be happening to have a better security posture. So try to identify what you already have and try to see how can you do more with what you have. So even before of taking in or bringing another solution, right? We're seeing a lot of organizations today are driving segmentation projects because it's probably one of the most cost-effective initiatives that could happen without touching the assets themselves, but still helping to reduce the overall risk. Measure total cost of ownership. Now, this is important. We're seeing a lot of, there's always this shiny tool syndrome. You plug something in, you start seeing some insights, some data, some findings, some eye candy dashboards. That's always kind of nice. But as you move along with rolling out, as you move along with deploying, it gets more complex. Deploying tons of sensors, changing network configurations, different types of things. So total cost of ownership, trying to analyze that in advance and understanding what's going to be the total cost of ownership of a project is a key for success. We've seen a lot of projects, a lot of companies, that we've been working with that has struggled throughout the past because they started with some technology or with some vendor, and they deployed in one site. They deployed in the second site. And then they realized that they cannot do the same in a global scale. That's just too heavy. So all of a sudden, they started figuring it out, and they did something that, I don't know if it's the most cost-effective way, but just deploy something to have something there, but then not really doing something about it. So again, total cost of ownership is a key. And the last part, ease of use. I've never seen, at least in the years I've been working in this space, someone from headquarters and IT security analysts taking actions remotely with insights. As much as smart they can be, they don't always understand the consequences. They don't always understand what does it mean to take this change. So ease of use, especially when we are at the end of the day addressing or enabling operational teams to be involved in this process, because we need them to be involved. We need them to validate, we need to work with them. Sometimes the people on site are the ones taking actions. So it really needs to be simplified for them because they're not cybersecurity experts. They're great of what they do, networking, operations, maintenance, but they're not cybersecurity experts. So we need to simplify it for them so they'll be able to actually take actions based on guidance, based on processes, based on support. So again, some things to remember when addressing and choosing a technology out there. So to try and summarize, right, it's not just about technology. As we all know, people, process, technology, those are key elements for success in scaling an OT security platform effectively. Meaning we need to first address the people, who are the stakeholders, who needs to be involved, who needs to be endorse this project, who needs to be engaged to make it happen later on. And as soon as early as possible is usually the best option. Processes, trying to figure out who will do what with this tool, how this will work, how this will influence the organization. It doesn't mean it needs to be 100%, but there should be some understanding what should be done. We've seen places where companies deployed solutions and it just sits there. And then a few years later, they get a ransomware attack. And then they're thinking to themselves, wait a second, I had a technology tool, I've invested. But what do you expect if you're not doing anything with it? So again, processes, people are key. And then, of course, technology is something that's going to help you scale, something that you can roll out kind of with as the things we talked about. Also using modular solutions, not one fit all. Those are key elements to remember when addressing that. Questions? Yes. This is the challenge of such a big room with not a lot of people. I think we'll hear you.
So my question is, obviously, you kind of showed a picture of the three-legged stool, the people, process, technology. And oftentimes I see, you know, in sites that I visit, there's a lot of deferred risk to outsourcers or integrators or different parties that may be involved in the OT process, and then the companies inherit those risks. Do you have any advice on how to, you know, not necessarily like a RACI, but how to kind of like score those risks in the process? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So in general, so again, as I mentioned, I think supply chain in this domain is complex. Especially, we're talking about, again, environments that were built many years ago, sometimes insecure by design. Nobody thought about cybersecurity. My recommendation would be, first of all, there's IEC 62443 standard that actually addresses the specific topic of supply chain and roles and responsibilities between like the asset owner, the system integrator, and the automation OEM. And what the roles and responsibilities for each and every stakeholder within the process. It's not bulletproof. It's not the only way, but it starts to create awareness. But I will say that at the end of the day, I do think it's the asset owner responsibility to be aware and demand it from their suppliers. It doesn't mean that they need to take full responsibility up to the last mile within the everything, but it means that they need to be aware in order to challenge their suppliers to take some responsibilities within the way. Now, unfortunately, it's not always comes for free, because if you want to have that and maintain this and continuously get updates from your suppliers that they're taking responsibility and things like that, sometimes it adds costs. But again, this is why I think I've seen use cases where, let me give you an example. Okay, so a system integrator deployed an automation OEM DCS environment. Now, the system integrator will try to do it as cheap as they can. Because again, it's all about business. If the asset owner didn't request anything related to cybersecurity, I have significant doubt that a system integrator will do anything regarding cybersecurity, right? And then we saw that it was actually placed with almost like again, basic some security configurations. So I think it needs to start from the asset owner to be able to demand and have the awareness around it. I do think, again, just using something tangible, the IEC 62443 actually addresses it kind of nicely. So my recommendation would be take a look at that. And this is at least my advice around that.
Any other questions?
Hi. Oh, thanks for the talk. My question was around, you mentioned kind of local playbooks and adapting to, specific sites or plants. From a, global program rollout, do you see that more as an exception management policy? Say like, you have an enterprise program, you enforce it at the sites, and then site A can't, change passwords from default because the system doesn't allow for it or anything like that? Is it an exception management process or developing a program per site, do you think?
I don't know that it's necessarily exception management. It's more of, you incorporate it into the global strategy, global processes, and you try to stay as uniform as you can. The exceptions are, sometimes it can be an extension. I don't like to use the word exception because it has a connotation that we're doing something, special for this one site or a couple sites or a country or a region, whatever it may be. And even though we may be doing things differently, it's not, I would stay away from the word exclusion or, exception. But I want to say that what we have seen are nuances between the different regions, and we just try to incorporate that into the overall global process.
Let me chime in and add that, again, if you remember, we talked about resistance. You don't want to, at the very beginning of the project, create such a resistance, saying like immediately, as I mentioned, right, we had a few sites that like were afraid to show their environment because they knew immediately they're going to get feedback like you're bad, like you have a really, really bad posture, things like that. So I think it's this is why we emphasize it's collaboration, it's endorsement, it's enabling, it's awareness. It's first of all letting them know that it's okay. We understand you're not where we want to be. And I think the right thing to do is not to immediately go and say, enforce, no, change it. Because again, we talked about resistance. So I think the first thing would be it's okay, like even emphasize, this is fine. It's better, maybe even better than nothing, right? But then the goal would be still to have a global standard within the organization, because it will ease everyone's life at the very end. It's just that now it matters of when does this end arrives. That would be our, from what we're seeing in the market, that probably would be the right advice, how to tackle that without creating some resistance, but actually onboarding the team and saying, we're going to help you, and we're going to take the time that is needed, because we understand you have so many other things to do, and this is not the highest priority. So this is usually what we see. Okay.
Recommendations for team members here listening as to where to inject those engagement points? Do you do it at the meeting kickoff? Do you do it with particular milestones? How are you encouraging those IT and OT team members on a project to work together?
Thank you. Good question. So I want to say that, in some instances, so usually in larger organizations, we have observed that it's really helpful to engage different segments of the business, even in the evaluation phase. Because if we don't, we're going to be introducing an enterprise solution, and maybe the initiative from, team A has a focus on solving whatever problem, whatever challenge they see, but then there may be another segment of the business that sees it from a different perspective and has different viewpoints that they can add, and so really involving the relevant stakeholders as early on in the process as possible is key. And then, of course, as the effort progresses, then engaging the relevant stakeholders at the different touch points is important. And not everybody is going to be involved in every stage, of course, but mapping it all out, you're going to have different stakeholders in the pre-planning phase. You're going to have different people in the execution phase. And so, yeah.